I want to thank Derek and the elders for giving me this opportunity to speak with you this morning. And I bring greetings from the congregation in George. Everybody in the Western Cape should know where that is. We brought some rain, and we sent some rain this way. I hope you received it. I'm glad Derek didn't tell any jokes about me, because I would have to deny all of it. Either that or you take it with a pinch of salt. He also told me I have I shouldn't go longer than 2 hours. Because the fathers want their tea before lunchtime. And then the gentleman asked me for the scripture reading. And I said to him, that's all right, I'm going to do it myself. To read through the first 10 chapters of Proverbs is going to take a while, so I'd rather do it myself. My lesson this morning is entitled, Crucial Lessons for a Wise Father. Lessons for a Wise Father. One little boy was asked, what is the definition of Father's Day? And he said, it's like Mother's Day, only you don't spend as much. And someone else says a father is someone who carries pictures where his money used to be. And then the phone company tells us that the calls on Father's Day are not as many as they are on Mother's Day. And most of them are collect. For those who are fathers, and for those who are blessed enough to have believing and loving children, Father's Day is a very special time. But unfortunately, the high priority that we place on fathers is being systematically attacked by the society around us. Whatever may be happening in our society and whatever may be happening around us, in the church, we should still be bringing up godly children. And fathers have a responsibility, particularly to their sons, who tend to be, for the most part, more rebellious than daughters. If fathers will faithfully teach their sons, they will be an example to the next generation. So the scripture places a high priority on fathers to teach their sons and therefore to raise up a godly generation. And because God wanted us to make sure that it is followed carefully, He gave fathers a manual to use on their sons. And that manual that we have is called the book of Proverbs. We are going to go through the first 10 chapters of Proverbs in a very general sense to see what the book of Proverbs says to fathers and how fathers are to teach their sons. If you look at Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 8, it says, "Hear, my son, the instruction of your father, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." And in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "My son, if you will receive my sayings." Chapter 3, verse 1, "My son, do not forget my teaching." Chapter 4, verse 1, "Hear, O sons, the instruction of a father." Chapter 4, verse 10, hear my son, and accept my warnings. Chapter 4, verse 20, my son, give attention to my words. And so it carries on throughout the book of Proverbs. As fathers go, so go nations, so go generations, and so goes history. So God took the principles of godly living and He packaged them into the 31 chapters that we find in the book of Proverbs. Now, a proverb is very simple. It is a principle stated in concise terms. We could say that a proverb is wise in content and concise in form. So the primary duty of a father is not like one little boy said, to take out the trash or to bring home the bacon or even to fix what's broken. The primary duty of a father is to teach holy living to his sons and to his daughters. And if a son will learn these things, he will be a blessing to his father and he will be blessed by God. These are the lessons that you must teach your son. Lesson number 1, teach your son to fear God. Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Chapter 9 verse 10, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So everything starts with fearing God. Teach your son to fear God. What do you mean, teach your son to fear God? On the one hand, it has a positive aspect, a reverential respect, a reverential awe for who God is. I have to teach my son what God is like. I have to teach my son the attributes of God. I have to teach my son that God is powerful, that God is holy, omniscient, omnipresent, that He is immutable. His nature never changes. He is just, He is merciful, kind, loving, and gracious. I must teach my son to reverence the greatness of God. And then on the other side, I must teach my son to fear God's displeasure, to fear God's right to punish, God's right to chasten, and God's right to judge. If you want to do your son the greatest favor that any father could ever do, teach your son to fear God. Teach him what God is like. They must know who God is, and they must learn to worship God, which is a part of fearing Him. And you teach not only by what you say, but also by what you do. So do you worship faithfully on the Lord's Day? Are you consistent and faithful in your worship to God? Are you faithful in studying the Word? Does your son look at you? And does he see a true worshipper? Whatever pattern of worship you have established for yourself, you have established for your son. And most likely for his son to follow. So, my question is, what kind of legacy are you leaving? Are you leaving a legacy that your children, your sons will follow that you are a godly role model for them. Lesson number 2. Teach your son not only to fear God, but also to guard his mind. Teach your son to guard his mind. In chapter 3 and verse 3, and among many other places, it introduces the heart. The writer mentions kindness, a beautiful word that encompasses love, loyalty, faithfulness, graciousness, fidelity, mercy, and righteousness. And then truth, or accuracy, reliability, or dependability. And you take those two things, you combine them together: love, loyalty, faithfulness, fidelity, along with accurate, reliable truth. And you bind them around your neck. You write them on the tablet of your heart. If you will, you inscribe them in the stone of your mind. In other words, teach your son to guard his mind. When the assault on the human mind is at such a level that we find today through the media, children need to find a way and need to have a way to guard their mind. And that is the job of all of you fathers, to teach your son to guard their mind. In chapter 4, verse 23, the writer says, "Watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the spring of life." Guard your mind diligently, because everything from life flows from it. Out of it comes your conduct. Out of it comes everything in your life. The father then has a task of ensuring that their son's mind is programmed with the right things. The things that go in need to be virtuous, need to be good, need to be right. And everything that is wrong needs to be put away. Fathers, you are the guardians of your children's minds. You are the ones who your sons look up to. You are the ones who have to teach your sons what to look at, what to listen to, and what they have to put aside, and what they are not to look at, and what they are not to listen to. That is your duty before God. We have to protect our children from what they are exposed to. I don't even need to tell you, as Derek said during the Bible study this morning, don't watch what he watches. You just need to turn on the television and you'll know the kind of things that you don't need to watch, that you don't need to allow your children to watch. That is the duty of a father. Teach your son to fear God. Teach your son to guard their mind. Lesson number 3. Teach your son to obey their parents. All throughout this entire section, we have heard the words, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction." They are repeated over and over and over again. Verse 20, "My son, give attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your sight. Keep them in the midst of your heart," or your mind. And this is reinforcing the first commandment with a promise. Children, obey your parents. in the Lord. That means discipline. Who likes disciplining their children? Come on, all you cruel fathers, put up your hands. You got the hammer. You got the hammer. All right, the bigger the problem, the bigger the hammer. But remember, Derek also said that it is not to be used for, what was your word? Conflict resolution. Okay, it is not for conflict resolution. Okay, so teach your children to obey your parents. Okay, but you can't hammer it into them. Okay, it's not for that. Teach your sons to obey what you say. That means discipline. Chapter 3, verse 11 says, "My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord, or to loathe his reproof." And again in verse 12, "For whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects a son in whom he delights." And chapter 10, verse 13, "A rod is for the back of him who lacks understanding." So if your child lacks understanding, you beat it out of them. Okay, or you beat understanding into them. Whichever way you choose. When your son does not want, when your son does not do what you want him to do, use a rod. In other words, discipline your child. Later on in Proverbs it says, "He has rebellion in his heart. Drive it far from him with a rod." And this is discipline done not in anger, but in love. Discipline not in anger, but in love. Whom the Father loves, he disciplines. And in addition, this discipline is done for the purpose of conforming your son to wisdom, of breaking his self-will, of removing foolishness, of delivering him from spiritual death, and for the purpose of making him a delight to his parents. All of these things we find taught in the book of Proverbs. Teach your children to obey and use the rod to reinforce, because God says that physical punishment done with love is a strong corrective measure. And that way, your children will learn to obey their parents. And if they learn to obey their parents, and if their parents are advocating the law of God, the children will learn to love the law of God. If they learn to obey their parents and if they submit to their parents, they will then also learn to submit to the laws of society around them. A disobedient child not only brings spiritual disaster, but an antisocial personality, and very oftentimes becomes a criminal adult. You have a task, fathers, to teach your children to obey their parents. You have a task, fathers, to teach your children to love God. You have a challenge before you to teach them to guard their minds. And then lesson number 4, teach your son to choose his companions. Teach your son to select his companions. A father has a responsibility to teach his son to select his friends, and not his friends select him. Do you remember what the Apostle Paul said? Bad company corrupts what? Good morals. Bad company corrupts good morals. And unfortunately, however way you try and spin it, good never overcomes evil. The way that you talk, you always pick up, and for some other reason, you always pick up the bad. Your friends never pick up the good. Bad company corrupts good morals. Your children cannot rise above their acquaintances. And rarely does a child have the ability to elevate themselves above the constituent group in which he functions. In other words, a child is going to be the same as the group that he is found in. He doesn't grow above the group that he is a part of. You have to help him to select his companions, to select good friends, good people to be friends with. Chapter 1 verse 10 says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent." In other words, don't get sucked into the gang. And then the writer carries on and he says, if they say, "Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause, let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. We will find all kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us, and we will have one purse." Here is the gang appealing to the young person, sucking or trying to suck another person in to the evil ways and for the evil purposes. Isn't it amazing the kind of action that for one fleet moment of pleasure that wicked men will take the life of another or inflict lifelong pain on another? Pointless, senseless gang violence. It is an unthinkable thing what people will do for a simple thrill. And they want to take the innocent, they want to take the young, they want to take the naive. And they say, come with us, throw in your lot with us, and we will do all kinds of wicked things. Fathers, you have a tremendous task ahead of you. There is tremendous peer pressure on your children to conform to a gang, to conform to a group. It is your responsibility to teach your children to select their company and not let their company select them. You need to teach your children how to select their companions. Fathers, this is your duty. To say this to your son. Son, fear God. Obey your parents. Guard your mind. And finally, select your companions. You see, what fathers do is simple. They produce a next generation. And it either moves up or it moves down from there. It either gets better or it gets worse. You have this duty as a father, that if you fail to teach your children to love God, the devil will teach them to hate God. If you fail to teach your children to guard their mind, Satan will gladly teach them to have an open mind. If you fail to teach your children to obey their parents, Satan will gladly teach them to rebel and to break their parents' heart. And if you fail to teach your son to select his companions, the devil will gladly choose them for him. Fathers, you have a great responsibility that God has given you to this generation and also to the next. Let us stand together as we sing our hymn to encourage you.